Same as last time, we're going to use the chat box throughout this session. So you can see I've already written in there. But same thing as normal. If you've got any questions, you can type them up in there. I wouldn't mind everyone saying hello. I've got Mia. Hi, Mia. Hi, Caitlin. You said hello. I've said hi to Taryn. Hi, Taryn. And same as last time too, we might put our microphones on mute while we've got our beautiful guest presenters talking to us, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end as well. Tiana, anything you want to mention before we hand it over?
No, welcome. Thanks for joining us so early, as always.
On this cold Saturday lockdown morning. Good times. Now, we are really lucky today, guys. We've actually got 4 guest presenters, 2 of which are with us now, and 2 will be in the second session after we have our little break. So we are joined by everyone here from the AMCS, which is the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And we've been really lucky to line up some very special talks today. So you might see Leo over here. Leo's going to be joining us to talk about sharks. Yeah?
Yeah, sharks.
Am I correct? Yeah. Yes, about sharks and rays very soon. But we're going to start with a very special guest presenter. Down below me on my screen is David from the AMCS. And David works with the Great Barrier Reef. Am I correct?
That is correct.
So we're going to hear a little bit from both of these guys, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end of that. So sit back, relax. David, you have the floor. I'm excited to hear everything that's going on.
Right, well, I'm going to share my screen to get into my presentation. Can everyone see Fight for Our Reef on their screen now?
I can.
Wonderful. So to get us started, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered all across the country. We're gathered on Aboriginal land, the land was never ceded, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. The people in my area in Brisbane are the Yagara and Turrbal people. And I also want to particularly think about the traditional owners of the sea country of the Great Barrier Reef. So Aboriginal people have been, looking after and fishing the Great Barrier Reef for many thousands of years in a really sustainable way. And so I think we have a lot to learn from traditional owners of Australia about how we can, better manage and look after our beautiful places. So before we kind of get started with my presentation, I'm basically going to tell you a bit about myself and how I got to be in this position, let you know about all the kind of the threats facing our beautiful Great Barrier Reef, and then kind of what we do at the AMCS to try and protect it and what you can do in your lives to help as well. And so, when you think about fighting for the reef, like what the biggest threat for the reef is, like what comes to mind? Like, do you want to just like put in the chat, like what do you think the biggest threat to the Great Barrier Reef is? And I'll let you know whether you're correct or not. Do I see the chat on here? I think I do. I'll wait for a few things. Oh, Caitlin's got it in one. Climate change, nailed it. So yeah, and so I think a lot of people who aren't as, clued on as you guys clearly are, think that many other things are threats to the Great Barrier Reef that aren't as big as this one. And I think, so therefore, in campaigning to protect the Great Barrier Reef, we're essentially campaigning to fix climate change, which is a big issue, but one that I'm super passionate about and have been campaigning on for a number of years now as both a volunteer and now as a kind of paid campaigner. So I'm really excited to show you a bit of my journey and what we do in this space. To get us started, some real basic climate science that I'm sure you're already aware of, but just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. What are we talking about when we're talking about climate change? We're talking about heat being trapped in our atmosphere, which is normal, which makes us a habitable planet, which provides all the life on Earth that we love. But we're putting out greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, etc., that's making a bigger, thicker band around the world and heating us up to a point where temperatures are now raised at least 1 degree above in pre-industrial standards, which is really crazy. And of course, this this graph shows that increase in CO2 is perfectly aligned with increases in temperature. I've hit some sort of captioning thing. I don't know if you're seeing this on my screen as a real screen as well. But anyway, I'm not sure what's going on there. And so AMCS has been on the forefront of protecting the Great Barrier Reef for over 50 years. Our first big campaign was around saving the barrier reef from what was then the threat to the reef. Was they wanted to mine for limestone. They wanted to literally dig up big chunks of coral to be used in various industrial processes. And then they wanted to drill for oil. And this was all before it was a marine park. And so we were fighting to protect it in that sense, and we were able to get it, protected into a marine park, and also, giving it World Heritage status, which is really cool. And so my kind of journey with fighting for the Great Barrier Reef started a few years ago now, when I first saw this map. And so for those who may not have been to Queensland, this is part of central Queensland. You've got the Great Barrier Reef in the dark blue, and then you've got this huge Galilee Basin in the left corner. So that's where at the time, there were 9 mega mines proposed of coal, and then all these coal ports that you can see along the Great Barrier Reef, where they wanted to dredge the seafloor and then dump millions of tons of the seafloor back into the marine park. And it would all be fine, and we'd be able to protect the reef while also exporting a huge amount of carbon dioxide at the same time. And I first saw this map when I was quite young. I was at university. I don't know if you can see me in this photo. I was at a youth climate summit organised by the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and they're headquartered in Melbourne. So if you haven't heard them, check them out. They were really pivotal part for me in being where I am today. And when I saw this map, I just couldn't believe that, this was happening. Like, I grew up in Cairns on the Great Barrier Reef, which is even further north on this map. And, went out to the reef with my family growing up, and, kind of took for granted how beautiful and pristine this place was, and just thought that our leaders would be acting in the best interests of this place that was so important for like local industry. Like, the tourism industry is really huge in Cairns because everyone wants to come and see the reef. And then when I got to university and was learning more about how our politicians were like dropping the ball on climate change, and then proposing not only not to reduce emissions like we should be doing, but increase emissions through exporting all this new coal, I was just frustrated, mad, and just knew I had to do something about it. And so I immediately joined my local youth climate group at my university, and got active talking to my peers, and getting people to sign petitions, getting active on the campaign to try and stop this development. At the time, it was all about the coal ports, trying to stop the coal ports, and it was really successful. So we did a bunch of actions in talking to the banks. So like we had rallies like this one that I was at, that was a kind of collaboration with AMCS and AYCC and other groups. And we also spoke a lot to bank staff. So we would go into bank offices and say, hi, did you know that your bank might be funding a coal port on the Great Barrier Reef, and they'd be dumping the dredge spoil in the marine park, all that sort of stuff. And it was really successful. And we were able to get all the banks to pull out and not fund the coal ports. And eventually we were able to get the Queensland government to basically put a ban on the dumping of dredge spoil into the marine park, which was a huge win. And we were able to stop all of those new coal ports on the reef. So now there's no plans for expansion of coal ports. And if anyone wants to dredge in the Great Barrier Reef, they have to put the dredge spoil on land. They can't dump it out in the water. So it was a huge win for conservation. And so this photo was from Airlie Beach, which is right near the Whitsundays, right near one of the proposed port developments, where my former colleague Cherry did a really good job of bringing together traditional owners, businesses, community members to oppose the expansion, the inappropriate expansion right next to this beautiful place. And yeah, it's been really inspiring. So then that was in 2015, and that was just before we saw the world's worst coral bleaching event ever. This was in 2016, and we saw corals all around the world react really visibly to the impacts of climate change. So, we saw corals go from healthy to bleached to dead all around the world, and our reef was not, didn't escape that. And so when I first started with AMCS in 2017 as a staff member, we saw this is what we were dealing with. We were dealing with a heat wave around the world that caused severe coral bleaching in the far northern section in 2016, and then the central section in 2017. And all up, we saw 50% of the shallow water corals die in 2 years, which was, devastating to say the least, and a real wake-up call for everyone that, this big, beautiful place isn't forever if we don't take seriously the threat of climate change and, rapidly reduce emissions, go to renewable energy, and, do everything we can to look after this place. And there was a lot of really good science that came out of the time that showed in really stark terms what we were dealing with. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we are now seeing this level of coral bleaching at 1 degree of warming. And the consensus of scientists, so kind of like the very lowest common denominator of what coral reef scientists and climate scientists are saying, is that if we increase by another 0.5 of a degree, we're going to lose 70% of the world's coral reefs. And if we get to 2 degrees of warming, we're going to lose nearly all coral reefs in the world, which is a very frightening statistic that I think causes a lot of us to act really, want to act even more. And so it's really clear that to have for our reef to have the best chance for the future, we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or lower. And we've got to assume that in that 70% range, our reef being so big and well managed in general terms, that you'd think parts of our reef would be the best parts of that 70% of the 30% that remain. So yeah, frightening stuff. And then of course, if 2020 wasn't bad enough on fronts, we had another coral bleaching event in 2020. And so as you can see on the right now, this is the kind of map that we've seen. And so, the people who do this go up in a plane and fly over coral reefs across the length and breadth of the Great Barrier Reef and take notes on what bleaching they've seen. And so this is only bleaching. It doesn't show mortality, which is a different concept, obviously, and one that you need to be in the water to. And so in 2020, we saw it was the most widespread coral bleaching event in the sense that they saw widespread bleaching from all the way up to the top, all the way to the bottom, which, as you've seen on the left and on the other two panels, it had been more isolated, whereas this one, it was really, really nowhere was spared, except, of course, this huge bit on the outer reef in the north and in the south as well. And so that means that a lot of the prime tourist sites out of Cairns and Port Douglas didn't get bleaching this year, which was really great news because they were already seeing corals kind of start to regenerate from 2016, 2017. And fortunately, they didn't see as bad bleaching, but obviously this isn't any good news. And scientists, now that restrictions are easing with COVID, hopefully they'll be able to get back in the water and check out what's going on in terms of mortality, because we're not really sure the extent of that. There are some anecdotal reports from certain places that because coral bleaching is all based on heat, that there was a sudden drop in temperatures towards the end of the bleaching season, as we're now calling it, and that the microorganisms within the algae that were expelled because of the heat would have been able to get back into the coral due to the drop in temperatures. So we're hoping that happened a lot of the places, but it's too early to tell. And so then if we're talking about this global issue of climate change, what do we do about it? What's Australia's contribution? So obviously on the left, I'm seeing the global greenhouse gas emissions, and carbon dioxide caused by fossil fuels is by far the biggest contributor. And so that's the burning of coal, gas, oil. And Australia is responsible for 5% of that whole chunk, which is pretty incredible given how small a population we are. And so this includes our exports. So those the coal and gas that's going out through the Great Barrier Reef already, there are already coal ports there. That's a huge part of that. And so there was a recent study that showed that our exported emissions are greater than the domestic emissions of Germany, Canada, Turkey, and the UK combined, which is pretty mind-boggling. And then there was another study that showed that our contribution to climate change could be up to 17% by 2030, because our policies currently don't show us reducing our emissions, whereas other countries are reducing their emissions. So we have a whole lot of work to do. And so what does that mean for us? We're building the movement of people who care about these issues and are taking action to keep coal and gas in the ground and move to renewable energy. And you may have heard of the Stop Adani movement, and we're part of that, trying to keep that one of those mega coal mines that would unlock the whole Galilee Basin. We need to keep that in the ground. We're working with the tourism industry. So before I moved to Brisbane with AMCS, I was based in Cairns, and I was on the ground working with locals who are really passionate about the reef and want to protect it, and especially in the tourism industry. So on the right, that's me with a Reef Climate Declaration with Col McKenzie, the CEO of the Association of Marine Park Tourism Operators. We got them to sign on to a big, bold climate declaration, which was exciting, made a lot of news. And then on the left, there's people that work in the dive industry who organize this kind of fun protest after work to show, the world that they're really part of this push to get coral, not coal. We're stopping the money going to these projects. Westpac we've been campaigning on for ages, and a couple of years ago they made a promise not to invest in any new coal basins, which rules out funding for the Galilee Basin and Adani, which is really exciting. We've been able to stop public money to Adani and these coal ports as well. So this is me in Cairns campaigning in the electorate of then Treasurer at the state level, Curtis Pitt. He was in charge of saying yes or no to $1 billion loan from the federal government that would go to Adani, and we were able to push the government to do the right thing and not to give the money, which was really awesome. And we won, which was really fun. And then we've done work around a federal election. So again, in Cairns, we were there to talk with the then opposition leader, Bill Shorten. This was a volunteer, Beck, who got to speak with him. We were there when various politicians came to town to send a really clear message about what we wanted for our reef. And we talked to voters on doors. We had our kind of scorecards that you can see there that compared the different parties' policies when it came to protecting the Great Barrier Reef. And then this is election night, which was very mixed emotions, because we, of course, saw a government re-elected that doesn't have strong policies to protect the Great Barrier Reef, so that was pretty disappointing. But we can be really proud of our efforts, and we were able to, make the reef a really big issue to the point where our local MP, who was re-elected, he made a really big effort to show that to maybe pretend to be really pro-environment more than he is. So it goes to show that people really know that this is a big issue for people. And so kind of moving ahead in terms of trying to keep coal in the ground and get to renewable energy, we're kind of continue to build a strong, diverse movement. We're delaying the Adani coal mine, which is that big first mover in the Galilee Basin, until the cost-benefit analysis means they have to walk away. We're building the political space for strong action, including new coal. So that's, getting, politicians to go ahead with all those big renewable projects, which we love. And so obviously this has been a lot of bad news. So I wanted to kind of have some good news in here, that, renewable energy is really taking off. It's the cheapest form of power around the world. And other countries are doing really good things. Like, for example, the UK, which started the Industrial Revolution that got us starting to burn coal in the first place. They're going to completely phase out coal by 2025, which is pretty exciting. And other, even parts of China and the US, which are those, big polluters that we kind of think, oh, they're not doing anything. They're actually, the sub-states of them are actually doing good stuff, which is exciting. And here in Australia, that's kind of happening as well, where the state level people are doing some good things, where South Australia is on track for 100% renewable energy by 2030. The ACT and Tasmania are basically already there right now. And as a whole, all of the different targets for different states and territories, they're all the same, which is to get to zero net emissions by 2050, which is the right goal. But the fact is that without federal government policy, it's just kind of chaotic, and we really need that policy certainty to be able to get moving on renewable energy. And there's the thought that, currently our emissions are rising, our exports are continuing to increase, but it doesn't have to be this way. We can, in fact, get to 100% domestic renewable energy here in Australia, and then we can also export renewable energy. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that space, where there's plans to have a literal line of energy from the Northern Territory to Singapore, where you can just directly export solar, or you can kind of use renewable energy to create hydrogen gas, which you can then export kind of like gas in Australia to countries like South Korea and Japan that currently accepts our fossil fuels. And so there's definitely ways that we can replace this dirty, polluting industry of the past with the clean energy of the future. So that's what we're really pushing for. And of course, climate change isn't the only threat to the Great Barrier Reef. This photo was from a big flood last year where, poorly looked after farms can leach a whole bunch of sediment and fertilizers that get washed out to sea and smother the great corals, which is obviously not great. And so we are doing a lot of work on this effort as well. And so we've been able to push the state government here in Queensland to pass regulations that would mean that farmers have to comply with minimum standards so that this sort of thing doesn't happen in the future, which is exciting. Of course, other threats like the crown of thorn starfish outbreak that eat coral, and there's some various programs happening around that. Overfishing is a big issue in the reef, and Leo might touch on that a bit later. A different team in AMCF, our fisheries team, work really hard to improve all those laws so that we don't overfish and then screw up the ecosystem from that angle. And so it's not too late to save the reef. It's going to be a really big battle to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and give our reef the best chance of the future. But with people like yourselves who really care about these things, I really have hope. Especially the recent school strike for climate movement around the world has just been incredible to be a part of. This was in Cairns, and I was helping out the school strike organisers. And so I think it's really kind of woken many people up to say that, this is just a non-negotiable issue. It's going to affect all of our lives. And coral reefs are just the canary in the coal mine for climate change. It's going to have a whole lot of other disastrous impacts if we don't sort it out. And so what you can do, I would say, come visit the reef when you can. Obviously right now, Victoria's not in that space, but when it all kind of lifts, come visit because it's still beautiful. And I think it'll make you be more passionate to protect it after that and just really get active on climate change. And so when I first started getting active, I thought that meant conserving energy at home, turning off lights and everything. And then once I realized that our personal impacts are nowhere near what's needed to save the world, I kind of more focus on, the big companies and the big governments that have the power to change things. There's that stat around 70% of the world's carbon emissions are from 100 companies. So we're not to blame for climate change. It's big polluting industries that aren't regulated properly from government. So we need to use our democratic voice. We need to talk to our friends. We need to organize events, organize our friends to get active on climate change. And there are groups all around the place that are there to help you do that. And one of them is ours, and if you go to the Fight for Our Reef website, there's a whole lot of tools that can help you with how to have conversations about climate change and talk to your local MPs and let them know what you think. Even if you can't vote, they need to be representing you. And I really encourage you to get in touch with your MPs as you can, especially when people are, distracted with COVID. It's like a nice excuse not to have to talk about these difficult issues. But this climate change is going to continue long after the pandemic, and we need to get active on it now. So. Yeah, that's me. Thank you so much for my time, and I'll hand over to Leo.